Unfortunately, this bill has been politics from the start and about a public display of action rather than a well-considered proposal that aligns with the bill's stated aims. An inquiry timeline imposed upon Portfolio Committee 7, of which I'm a member, to ensure the government could be seen to be doing something before the year is out. The reality is that while the Coalition and Labor can agree that we need to reach net zero by 2050, the manner of reaching that target is arguably weakened under Labor's bill compared to targets regulated under the Coalition government. Yet Labor has sent out fundraising emails and funded data mining campaigns claiming that the Liberals don't support climate action. The importance of front-loading emissions reduction, that is, to reduce emissions as quickly as possible, as soon as possible, to ensure cumulative emissions do not increase the rate or intensity of global warming is critical. PC7 heard from 24 witnesses who appeared at very short notice, the vast majority of whom called for stronger action than what this bill originally has contained, and who were particularly aghast that the Coalition's target of a 70% reduction by 2035 may be entirely overridden. They were shocked by the lack of vision and highlighted that the objects of the bill did not relate to its contents. And I quote from Professor Penny D. Sackett's submission, and she's a distinguished honorary professor at ANU's Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. She said, quote, "These targets are insufficient for consistency with holding heating as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible or with holding it to well below 2 degrees Celsius," end quote. Disappointment, with a capital D, has been consistently expressed by the community that this Labor government is saying one thing and doing another when it comes to action to address climate change. And again, I quote Professor Sackett, "It is very strongly recommended that the puzzling, restrictive, illogical and ethically questionable clause of the bill, Part 2, Subclause 9.3, which restricts regulations for setting a specific interim target to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions in New South Wales by a particular date occurring before 30 June 2050 be removed," end quote. During the PC7 inquiry, we heard that the impact of the extension of the coal-fired power stations, Eraring and Vales Point, will be factored into the upcoming department annual report on emissions, which we anticipate will be delivered by the end of the year. These announcements, the extension of Eraring and Vales Point, are Labor announcements that are contrary to the stated aims of the bill. The sooner the better the department's report on emissions is released, and should it be with the Minister's office before public release, I urge the Minister to release that as soon as it's received. Unfortunately, given the short timeframe of the inquiry, we were unable to hear from many stakeholders who would have offered unique insights into the impacts of the bill on their communities and how the bill could be improved to address a wider range of concerns about the process of implementing the targets. These included stakeholders like Farmers for Climate Action and Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action. I do wish to thank all the witnesses who appeared in person and by video link, and all the individuals and organisations who made incredibly helpful submissions to the inquiry at such short notice. The transition to a net zero economy is not about reducing emissions for the sake of it. It is about ensuring energy security and energy price stability. The Australian Energy Regulator's Q3 report on energy prices that came out recently noted that average electricity prices fell in all regions compared to Q2 2023. Rooftop solar in September was 41% higher than last September, reducing demand from the grid. And the East Coast gas spot market prices averaged $10.44 per gigajoule after decreasing through the winter and into spring. The Climate Council has also recently released information stating that in Sydney, the average yearly gas bill for heating, cooking and hot water equals $1,866. And they say with savings made from shifting from gas appliances to electrical, people could save $898. And with further additional upgrades to thermal efficiency measures like glazing and insulation, people can save an additional $539. With all the measures combined, a household could be paying less than $400 for their total yearly energy bill. Over time, this results not only in fewer emissions, but a return on investment that pays for those upgrades and can be counted as net savings. And regarding security, we need to stop talking about baseload, which is an old-fashioned and now inaccurate way of looking at the grid. We now have a much wider range of energy inputs, including wind, solar, pumped hydro, gas and coal. We should be talking about dispatchable power, which AEMO notes is as equally as important as predictable power, which includes stored energy. In New South Wales, we already have trials of smaller community batteries, like in Bungarraby, which we've spoken about in this chamber before. The Honourable Peter Primrose raised that motion. And the enormous Waratah super battery on the Central Coast, which will be capable of providing a guaranteed continuous active power capacity of at least 700 megawatts and a guaranteed usable energy storage capacity of at least 1,400 megawatts per hour. And these are incredibly important changes that have happened under the former coalition government. It is also about preserving and encouraging biodiversity, which is made more difficult in the face of extreme weather events, from bushfires to floods and to heat islands, where we know, for example, that native bats during extreme heat days are literally falling out of trees as they overheat and expire. It is also, very importantly, about commercialising a thriving renewable energy tech sector, generating jobs, export opportunities and investment opportunities, as international finance is looking for places to put its money with the confidence that the regulatory environment will be stable and favourable. We heard from Mr. Tim Buckley during the inquiry. He's the director of the Climate Energy Finance Organisation, who raised the value of setting stronger targets to attract global finance. And I note that the global renewable energy market is currently around US $970 billion. Mr. Buckley stated that higher levels of commercial investment would stem from, I quote, an ambitious medium-term target, unquote. Mr. Buckley also said that confidence for investors and for corporations that those targets have substance was important to attract economic activity. Mr. Buckley also noted that New South Wales was falling behind Queensland and Victoria when it came to setting more ambitious targets, timelines and policies for emissions reductions. And certainly that's the case when we come to measurement and actually meeting those targets. This is incredibly serious, as you can be sure that Australian companies will take their business elsewhere if local conditions are falling behind the rest of the world. Vast Solar is one example of an organisation that has moved their operations to the US from Australia. It is a world-leading solar thermal company founded by an Australian, getting more overseas support and making business decisions accordingly. And now Vast Solar has the majority of its operations in the US, including the vast majority of its staff, and it's currently pursuing a public listing on the New York Stock Exchange. Mr. Buckley gave the following evidence regarding international investors for renewable energy. He said, their biggest problem is getting approvals and getting grid connection and having the confidence to invest. But we've seen it. The ACCC just approved the takeover of Origin Energy, Brookfield's pitch. We will invest 20 billion or 30 billion in Australia, and the vast majority of that will come in the eastern states, mainly in New South Wales and Queensland. This is the kind of investment we risk losing without strong and practical regulatory measures to reduce emissions, and the indication that we have a government that is serious about backing this up. There are questions that do remain about these bills, serious questions. Firstly, about the implementation timelines for the Net Zero Commission's establishment and operation. I also believe that commissioners should be required to make any conflict disclosures public, and there should be a requirement for regional representation. We still haven't seen the advice provided to the Minister by the Crown Solicitor, which was requested by the committee after the inquiry, or as part of the inquiry, regarding key components of the bill, in particular regarding the role of regulations, and I refer to Professor Sackett's comments earlier. The further role of regulations in providing a ceiling or rather than a benchmark or baseline to emissions reductions target is concerning. Unfortunately, there has been an acknowledged lack of clarity in the drafting. During the inquiry, the Honourable Mark Buttigieg stated during the public hearings that he understood there was, quote, a drafting error, end quote, in subclause 9.3. As I said, there remain serious questions about the role of regulations under this piece of legislation. Also, the question of acknowledgement that regional communities will be hard hit by a changing climate and a renewable energy transition. There are exciting opportunities for adoption of AgTech, but regional communities deserve recognition and support to make the transition and to acknowledge that their communities will be vulnerable in the face of climate change. Australia is the world's 14th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, not only CO2, but also including methane. We have a significant role to play, not only in reducing emissions, but also developing advanced renewable technologies that can be exported across the world, and also as an exporter of renewable energy itself, particularly noting things like hydrogen. I think of Indonesia, for example, one of Australia's close neighbours, the world's 4th largest emitter, where hydrogen could be exported to great effect from Australia. And I also note that we heard emphatically that China is doing more to reduce its emissions than almost any other country in the world, accelerating the rate of construction for renewable energy infrastructure. You can bet that if countries like Australia, as the 14th largest emitter, are not making serious efforts to reduce emissions, the 13 countries above us won't either. In the last 4 years, New South Wales has achieved an enormously positive turnaround, particularly driven under the leadership of Matt Kean, with multi-partisan support from the Nationals, Labor and the Greens, and generating billions of dollars in financial investment in New South Wales for renewable energy. I note that the recent 2023 Startup Muster report found that clean tech is one of the fastest growing startup sectors in Australia, overtaking fintech by a large margin. And I think it's important to recognise that Liberals are a natural home for conservation. We know that the original conservationists were Conservatives in the UK. Environmental conservatism is at the heart of true conservatism, but of course we need something to conserve. Importantly, economic stability and growth is actually critical for climate action. Johan Norberg writes in The Capitalist Manifesto, Why the Global Free Market Will Save the World, something that we all experience as truth, that people, quote, see the environment as less of priority during recessions, end quote. If this government can't manage economic growth and stability, it will make it much harder for the people of New South Wales to support a critical transition. The courage to give weight to these targets is in the implementation of the policies around it. And I again quote Mr. Buckley, "The cost of inaction to me is really obvious, and yet the solutions are there. I look at the last 3 months. We saw the New South Wales electricity price drop 65% year on year. More generation is the obvious solution. When I talk to investors, they totally agree with the CSIRO and AEMO that the lowest cost sources of new generation are wind and solar, firmed by batteries, pumped hydro and smart grids. There is something for all of us in the successful transition to renewables and the reduction of emissions in New South Wales, Australia and throughout the world. It is critical that we signal to the world that we are serious about reducing our emissions and be able to back it up as a written commitment with an enticing investment environment in a competitive international and interstate market. It is critical that New South Wales takes serious action to demonstrate that we are serious about making these changes as quickly as possible."